Robert Redfield, the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We have Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. We have Admiral Brett Giroir, Assistant Secretary for Health, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Is probably tired of hearing from me since I call him all the time. And Dr. Stephen Hahn, who's the Commissioner of U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you all for being here today, and I know it's going to be worthwhile. At this time, the chair is going to recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the lighting system. In front of you is a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. And of course, you should try to wrap up your testimony at that point, and the light will turn red when your time expires. You probably know this already, but I'll mention it again. So we're going to start with Dr. Redfield, recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you with my HHS colleagues. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic continues in the United States and around the world. This pandemic is the greatest public health crisis our nation and our world have confronted in more than a century. While overall case counts are going down, several communities are seeing increased cases driven by multiple factors, including increased testing, outbreaks, and evidence of community transmission. Right now, the most powerful weapon against this disease are social distancing, face coverings, and hand hygiene. These actions will help us contain transmission, along with readily available testing, comprehensive timely contact tracing, timely isolation of known cases, and self-quarantine to break the chains of transmission. Once again, I call on the American people to remain vigilant in our collective obligation to protect those who may be at risk for severe complications of COVID-19 due to age or underlying medical conditions. We must also lessen the burden of COVID-19 among racial and ethnic groups disproportionately impacted. CDC continues to improve its data collection of comprehensive data of each case, race, and ethnicity from our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. Reporting from hospital surveillance sites, for example, have increased in completeness on race and ethnicity from 30% to now more than 80%. CDC is also receiving more complete data from our public health partners. A recent CDC study examined more than 1.3 million COVID-19 cases, found that the most underlying health conditions were cardiovascular, diabetes, obesity, and chronic lung disease. Hospitalizations were 6 times higher for these individuals and death 12 times higher, those reporting these conditions compared to those without. CDC is working to ensure the equity and health outcomes and the social determinants are being addressed through the COVID-19 response. CDC continues to provide communities with technical expertise, tools, and information to confront the virus. CDC's created more than 1,500 specialized resource and guidance documents, which have been consulted more than 1.5 billion times on the CDC website. We've deployed over 5,000 personnel in the response. We have more than 40 rapid response teams on the ground now, providing local health departments and health officials with expertise in epidemiology, surveillance, infection control, laboratory science, and community mitigation. We're enormously grateful to the heroes of the response. That's the public health and healthcare professionals, the first responders, the critical infrastructure workers who have served and sacrificed too much. CDC and our nation's public health partners are actively working on the front lines of this pandemic to remedy the shortcomings in a public health system that has been under-resourced for decades. With your support, CDC has been able to award nearly $12 billion to states, territories, tribes, and localities to enhance their response capabilities. When confronted by any disease threat, CDC and public health departments must make real-time decisions based on real-time data. Data is the backbone of any disease threat response. With the resources that Congress has provided, data monetization is underway. We also must ensure that our laboratories have resilience, advanced technology, personnel, expertise, and supplies are being sourced. Our public health workforce must grow exponentially to address COVID-19 and future public health threats. Thousands of contact tracers are on board and being recruited by public health departments across our nation. Bottom line, sustained investment in the public health system is an investment in the health and prosperity of our nation. Last, CDC has begun to prepare for months ahead when the next season's influenza illness will occur simultaneously, potentially, with COVID-19, increasing the challenges on hospitals, healthcare professionals, and the public. This fall, before the seasonal circulation of influenza increased, I encouraged the American people to be prepared and to embrace flu vaccination with confidence for yourself, your families, and the communities. This single act will save lives. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Walden. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you today the role of the National Institutes of Health and Research addressing COVID-19. The approach to the NIH is very similar to what we do with other emerging infections. It's a four-pronged approach. First, to study the fundamental knowledge of the virus itself, as well as the host response to the virus. The second is to help develop diagnostics and assays. The third is to characterize and test therapeutics. And the fourth is to develop safe and effective vaccines. Speaking of the first, fundamental knowledge of the virus and what the virus is capable of doing. We've done a number of studies now that have informed how we're approaching therapeutics and vaccines. For example, the precise molecular structure of the spike protein, which is that part of the virus which actually gives it its name, coronavirus, because of these spikes that stick out from the virus. That is the way the virus binds to cells in the body. This has been precisely delineated by NIH scientists and those that we fund. Second, the demonstration of the precise receptor whereby the virus binds to cells in the body, allowing it to enter and cause disease. In addition, we develop animal models. We do natural history studies, such as understanding the virus in different demographic groups. Second is the development of diagnostics and assays. We need, and we will get within a reasonable period of time, based on a major investment in the RADx program, diagnostics that are point of care, simple, precise, sensitive, and specific. We hope by the end of the fall and into the early winter, we will have these for wide distribution. Third, the development and characterization of drugs. You've all heard of the first successful randomized placebo-controlled trial of a drug called remdesivir, which was used in hospitalized patients with lung disease. It showed a statistically significant but modest impact on decreasing the time to release from the hospital, namely faster recovery. In addition, this drug is now being used in combination with another drug that blocks the inflammatory response, baricitinib. We are also looking at a variety of others: convalescent plasma, hyperimmune globulin, other drugs, monoclonal antibodies, as well as other immune-based therapies. Fourth, the development of safe and effective vaccines, the hallmark of all really defining responses that we have to virus diseases. If you look at the history of viral diseases, it is generally vaccines that put the nail in the coffin of these types. We are now mounting a major effort in which we're collaborating with industry and public-private partnerships to get vaccine trials that are developed that harmonize with each other. In other words, to have multiple trials in which we have common questions that are being asked, common laboratories that are being looked at, common data and safety monitoring board, and common primary, secondary, and tertiary endpoints, so that the data can be compared from one to another. You've probably heard that one of those vaccines, and there are more than one, there are several that are moving along at various paces. One of them will enter phase 3 study in July. This is one that has already shown in preliminary studies some very favorable response in the animal models that were developed. There will be others that will follow 1 month, 2 months, 3 months later. Although you can never guarantee at all the safety and efficacy of a vaccine until you actually test it in the field, we feel cautiously optimistic based on the concerted effort and the fact that we are taking financial risks, not risks to safety, not risks to the integrity of the science, but financial risks to be able to be ahead of the game so that when, and I believe it will be when and not if, we get favorable candidates with good results, we will be able to make them available to the American public, as I said to this committee months ago, within a year from when we started, which would put us at the end of this calendar year and the beginning of 2021. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman, and be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci, and thanks for all your contributions to fighting this pandemic. And I'll say the same about Admiral Giroir, who I bother the most. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Admiral.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, and I always enjoy our conversation. You call me anytime. Ranking Member Walden, distinguished members of the committee. On March 12th, Secretary Azar requested that I lead the coordination of COVID-19 testing efforts within the Department of Health and Human Services. And I would like to be clear that although I am no longer full-time deployed to FEMA, I am maintaining my role coordinating testing. To date, the nation has performed over 27 million COVID-19 tests, now averaging about 500,000 tests per day. Even without any major technical advances, I estimate the nation will have the capacity to perform between 40 to 50 million tests per month by fall. To address the public health challenges over the past months, we implemented a phased approach to meet the testing needs at each stage of the pandemic, especially now during reopening when the need for testing is the greatest. In early March, HHS and FEMA developed and implemented 41 community-based drive-through testing sites in locations prioritized by the CDC in collaboration with our state and local partners. These sites have tested nearly 300,000 high-risk individuals and served as prototypes that have been duplicated multifold. Next, we leveraged trusted pharmacies to further implement community testing, especially for minorities and underserved. This federal program is now providing testing at 611 locations in 47 states in the district, 70% of which are in communities with moderate to high social vulnerability. This program has tested over 688,000 individuals. Federally qualified health centers serve over 29 million people across the nation. They provide care to 1 in 5 of those uninsured, 1 in 5 rural Americans, 1 in 3 living in poverty, and 1.3 million homeless. Again, to assure we reach these most vulnerable among us, 93% of FQHCs offer COVID-19 testing. To further expand access, we authorized all licensed pharmacists to order and administer COVID-19 testing under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness, or PrEP Act. Over 90% of Americans live within 5 miles of a pharmacy, again assuring widespread availability. On June 4th, using authorities provided to the Secretary under CARES, HHS released new mandatory laboratory reporting guidance so that we can confirm that all groups are benefiting equitably from COVID-19 testing. Lab reports must include demographic information like race, ethnicity, age, and gender. And today, I am pleased to announce the selection of Morehouse School of Medicine as the awardee for a new $40 million initiative to fight COVID-19 among racial and ethnic minorities, as well as rural and other socially vulnerable communities. This cooperative agreement with the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health's Office of Minority Health and Morehouse School of Medicine will develop and implement a strategic network of national, state, territorial, tribal, and local organizations to deliver COVID-19 related information to communities hardest hit by the pandemic. In the first year of this agreement, Morehouse School of Medicine will receive $15 million. This massive expansion of testing resulted in unprecedented demand for supplies, reagents, and laboratory platforms. To meet this demand, we secured the global supply chain through a military air bridge. We worked directly with manufacturers to increase domestic production. We collaborated with external partners to validate new technologies. We secured and prioritized scarce point-of-care tests for state public health laboratories, the Indian Health Service, and other critical needs. Finally, we used Title III of the Defense Production Act to further invest in domestic manufacturing. These actions and others have enabled our current efforts with states, territories, and tribes to implement evidence-based diagnostic and surveillance plans. I would like to close by recognizing my fellow officers in the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, the uniformed service that I lead. 4,482 officers have deployed to support the pandemic response, including to the Diamond Princess cruise ship in Japan, to our military bases repatriating Americans, to our community-based testing sites, to FEMA and task forces directly inside nursing homes, and to field hospitals across our nation, exemplifying the care and compassion that all of us feel for those who have suffered during this pandemic. I thank each and every one of these officers and their families, and on their behalf, I would like to thank all of you in Congress for supporting our training needs and the establishment of a Ready Reserve Corps to supplement our ranks during inevitable future national emergencies. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide these remarks.
Thank you, Admiral, and thank you for mentioning the both military and civilians who are out front in helping us during this crisis. We really appreciate all that they do, and we have to make sure that we help them as much as possible. So last but certainly not least, because the FDA is just as important, is Dr. Hahn, or Commissioner Hahn.
Sir. Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. First, I'd like to start by thanking all of you for your support of the agency and U.S. government with the laws that you've passed and become law of the land. It has helped a great deal in our response. FDA has a critical role in the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We remain focused on our mission of protecting and promoting the health and safety of Americans. President Trump has requested, and we have provided appropriate regulatory flexibilities to assure that the American public have access to critical medical products, safe foods, and a confidence that the government is taking measures to address important public health issues. FDA has used our emergency authorities since the beginning of this pandemic. We have issued more than 100 emergency use authorizations for diagnostics, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and other devices, as well as for drug products. Since the public health emergency was declared, we issued more than 50 guidance documents to help ensure the continuity of health care and safe food supply, and we put into place new initiatives to accelerate the development of needed products. Additionally, we have kept the American public up to date on what they need to do to protect themselves and to contain the virus from spreading. We are now preparing for the next phase of addressing this evolving crisis. It is mission critical that the agency continue to be diligent, assuring the safety of the products that we regulate, and that we also put in place processes needed to assure the protections that the public will need. There are a number of experiences we have gained over the past few months that will inform our plans. We recognize that we must be bold in our decision-making and advance effective solutions to achieve challenging public health objectives. Therefore, we have begun a comprehensive real-time review and assessment of our actions to date to address the COVID-19 pandemic. The objective is to identify and address potential organizational and programmatic changes that should be implemented without delay to advance the ongoing response to COVID-19. We need to assure that we leverage what is working well, while at the same time review our framework and policies to be positioned to effectively identify and respond to quickly evolving public health situations. A major focus of this effort will be to identify what regulatory policies should be continued and accelerated consistent with Executive Order 13294 signed by the President. Durable policy, organizational, and programmatic changes will be consistent with advancing the agency's public health mission and will inform our strategic priorities moving forward. One of the challenges facing FDA during the COVID-19 pandemic is how to assure the timely review of medical product applications despite an incredible surge in volume and constraints on our ability to conduct in-site inspections. I am pleased to announce today that FDA has maintained the same pace of meeting its goals on applications for medical products for the last 6 months that it has maintained in recent years. We are on target to meet our user fee goals for the drugs this year by reviewing and taking timely action on at least 90% of brand, generic, and biosimilar drug applications, even during the pandemic. Additionally, this work has continued at a time when the number of applications received in some centers is substantially higher than the pre-COVID-19 times. I want to thank the more than 17,000 employees of the FDA for their incredible efforts, one that reflects the remarkable dedication and commitment to the public health of all Americans. Finally, I'd like to discuss what is top of mind for all Americans, namely the work that FDA is doing to facilitate the development of safe vaccines and therapeutics. FDA launched an emergency review and development program called the Coronavirus Treatment Accelerator Program, or CTAP, and we continue to work night and day to provide guidance and to review proposals from companies, scientists, and researchers who are developing therapies. Let me be clear that data and science will dictate when we will have safe and effective treatments and vaccines for COVID-19, as Dr. Fauci just mentioned. Toward that end, FDA is using every available authority and applying every appropriate regulatory flexibility to facilitate development and testing. We have not lost sight of our solemn responsibility to the American people to ensure our decisions related to all medical products are based on science and data, and that is a commitment that the American public can have confidence in. Again, I assure you that the FDA will provide leadership, expertise, guidance, information, and whatever else is needed as we continue to address this unprecedented challenge. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Hahn. That concludes our openings from the witnesses. And so now we'll move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Now, you know that I'm very critical of the president for a lack of leadership from the start of this pandemic, which I think continues. And of course, it's difficult because you work in theory for the president. And I feel that many of you on many occasions actually wanted to take more leadership and be, as Dr. Hahn mentioned, or Commissioner Hahn, fully cognizant of the data and the science. So it's difficult because I'm going to ask you questions about the president's lack of leadership, and I know it's hard for you to answer those, so we'll see. But I do believe the president is encouraging behaviors that are not consistent with good public health, such as encouraging thousands to attend a rally and not mandate the wearing of masks. And I can't imagine that NIH or CDC would suggest this as a best practice in the face of this pandemic. So it's sort of like there's two versions of reality here. One's the president's and one's hopefully yours based on data and science. But I want to hear from the experts. So let me start with Dr. Fauci. You are a trusted voice and have always been candid with us and the American public. Give us an unvarnished view of where we are at our fight against COVID-19, quickly if you can.
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Chairman. It really is a mixed bag. We have a very large country, very heterogeneous, major differences, for example, between the New York metropolitan area and Casper, Wyoming. If you look at how we've been hit badly. I mean, anybody who looks at the numbers, we've had now over 120,000 deaths and we've had 2.5 million infections. So it's a serious situation. In some respects, we've done very well. Right now, for example, the New York metropolitan area, which has been hit extraordinarily hard, has done very well in bringing the cases down and using the guidelines that we have very carefully put together in a stepwise fashion to try and carefully reopen their city and their state. However, in other areas of the country, we're now seeing a disturbing surge of infections that looks like it's a combination, but one of the things is an increase in community spread. And that's something that I'm really quite concerned about that. And you know that this has been something that's been in the press over the past couple of days, where we were going down from 30,000 to 25 to 20, and now we sort of stayed about flat, and now we're going up. A couple of days ago, there were 30,000 new infections. That's very troublesome to me. The way you address that, and I've said this over and over again, is you have to have the manpower, the system, the testing to identify, isolate, and contact trace in an effective way so that when you see those increases, you can understand where they're coming from and you can do something about them. Right now, the next couple of weeks are going to be critical in our ability to address those surgings that we're seeing in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, and in other states. They're not the only ones that are having a difficulty. Bottom line, Mr. Chairman, it's a mixed bag. Some good and some now we have a problem with.
All right, now I'm going to have to ask about the president because you talked about testing and how important it is, and Admiral Giroir and I know how important it is. At his rally over the weekend, the president said, and I quote, "When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please," unquote. And this morning he said he meant this. So Dr. Fauci, do you agree with that? Does it make sense that to safely open our economy, we should be limiting the number of tests rather than ensuring that anyone who needs a test can get one? And you don't have to mention the president, I did, but tell us about the testing. And your microphone is on.
I, as a member of the task force, and my colleagues on the task force, to my knowledge, I know for sure, but to my knowledge, none of us have ever been told to slow down on testing. That just is a fact. In fact, we will be doing more testing, as you've heard from Admiral Giroir, not only testing to specifically identify people in the identify, isolate, and contact trace, but also much more surveillance if you want to get your arms around and understand exactly what's going on in community spread. So it's the opposite. We're going to be doing more testing, not less.
And then let me just ask the same question of Dr. Redfield. Do you agree with the president on this? Or do you think we should be testing more people? You don't want to talk about the president, just tell us if you think we should be testing more people.
Yes, Dr. Fauci said, all of us have been and continue to be committed to increasing readily, timely access to testing. We've made a marked improvement. We still have a ways to go. One of the key things, as Tony mentioned, is surveillance, expanding surveillance because of the asymptomatic nature of this infection. And in doing so, we're looking at ways that can really substantially enhance testing by potentially pooling samples. So right now, as Gerard said, we're doing 500,000, 600,000 tests a day. If we can pool samples 5 to 1, that would bring it to 3 million tests a day. So we're continuing to try to enhance testing. It's a critical underpinning of our response.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. I recognize Mr. Walden now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me go straight to the question that my colleague asked, and I'll just ask each of you for a yes or no answer. Has President Trump ever directed you to slow down testing for COVID-19 in the United States? Dr. Redfield?
No.
No, sir.
No, Congressman.
Thank you. All right, let's go to some other issues here. Dr. Hahn, you created a website, I believe, on the FDA site dealing with convalescent plasma and antibody-rich investigational therapies that may help fight the virus. What's the status of the research into the effectiveness of convalescent plasma in fighting COVID-19? What do we know right now?
Thank you, Congressman Walden. Really important question from a therapeutics point of view. As everyone here knows, convalescent plasma is where you take the natural immunity from a person who's recovered from COVID-19, those antibodies, and then administer it to a person who's sick. So we have partnered with BARDA and HHS, as well as the Mayo Clinic, to develop what's called an expanded access program. We have safety data from over 20,000 patients that shows this is a very safe therapy, and our preliminary assessment of the effectiveness of this plasma is quite encouraging. We continue to look at the information. If those data hold, we will have potentially another weapon in the armamentarium against COVID-19, pending those final results. This will also allow us to have information that will feed the development of monoclonal antibodies and something else called hyperimmune globulin, which we can pool that plasma and actually give it as an injection to people. So I think it's a good news story right now. We have to wait for the final data to come in, and we should know very shortly about that. There are also several randomized trials looking at this as well that are ongoing across the country.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Redfield, CDC has developed a new test to simultaneously detect 2 strains of influenza and the COVID-19 and is seeking an emergency use authority. How does the CDC envision its combined tests to be used?
Yeah, I think it's very important, as I mentioned, as we get to the fall, we're going to have influenza and COVID at the same time. And CDC is developing that test for the public health system, but in parallel, the private sector now has also got advanced development. Maybe Dr. Hahn wants to comment on similar tests in the private sector, so to facilitate timely diagnosis of these 2 co-circulating pathogens.
Dr. Hahn, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, sir. In
20 seconds?
cooperation with Admiral Giroir, we have been working with companies to actually look at that. Admiral Giroir has been at the forefront of this, and it's been a great
Admiral?
partnership.
I would just agree with my colleagues. We're all concerned about the possibility of co-circulation of influenza A and B as well as COVID-19 when it comes to flu season. So we want to do everything we can to simplify the diagnosis, and you can have if you have a single test, and we're working with multiple manufacturers. As is usual, the CDC is usually in the lead, but there are multiple manufacturers, both at point of care and laboratory, who will have this type of test available.
All right, excellent. You all have been subject to a lot of criticism, as has the president. Often that's leveled after we know facts we didn't know at the time when things started. And so it's really great if you have hindsight and 20/20 vision. You can look back and say, should have done that then. I want to look forward. What is it you need from Congress that you do not have now to have America ready for the fall? What should we be preparing for now for the fall? I don't care who wants to start, but I'm down to a minute to answer. So, Dr. Redfield?
I think first I want to just express our appreciation to Congress for the supplemental funding. I think it's of note that CDC has been able already to disperse $12 billion to the states to help prepare their COVID responses, and really that's an unprecedented amount of resources. I would only ask that we look to how to make this a sustainable investment as opposed to a sporadic investment to this particular challenge we have right now.
All right. Dr. Fauci, what do we need to worry about? What don't you have?
Well, I just to reiterate what Dr. Redfield said, we are extraordinarily grateful for the unprecedented amount of supplementary funding that the Congress gave to us, which really make it totally possible for us to do the kinds of things we need to do on an emergency basis.
Right.
But again, to mention what Dr. Redfield said, we have to establish some corporate memory. I've said to this committee literally many times over the many years that we forget things when we get distant from them. Yeah. We're going through a terrible ordeal right now. We need to have in place the stable type of support for preparedness for outbreaks. We will get through this. This will end, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we need to establish a system so that we are prepared for future outbreaks.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, could the other two just answer that question quickly? Admiral, what do you need you don't have? What should we be worrying about?
I want to express my thanks again to the committee, but let me get to the points. I think sustainability and commitment is very important. I was involved in Ebola in 2015 in Dallas, trying to lead some of the policy options during that time. And you see over a 5-year period, we sort of forgot all the lessons that we were trying to get implemented, including PPE and other stockpiles. I would say some of the biggest limitations, and I know everyone is working on this, is the national data infrastructure we need. When we started out, I'm calling up 100 hospitals a day trying to understand who's on an ICU bed, who's not, who has a ventilator, how much you have left. Okay. And we got through this early, not by systems, but by people working 24/7. The third thing is, I'm just going to pound it, the vaccine infrastructure in this country, to promote vaccination, to promote vaccine confidence, to make sure that people have the right information about safety and efficacy, that we order enough flu vaccine, because we really need to get everybody vaccinated this winter. One thing that minimizes our problems, if we get everybody flu vaccine, that's one less virus that could kill 20, 30, 50,000, 70,000, and potentially even be a co-infection with COVID.
Dr. Hahn?
Yeah, thank you. Again, thank you for the support. One big point I want to make here is that what we've learned during this epidemic is what Admiral Giroir said, is that we have an access to information issue. We have learned that we need to collect real-world evidence in real time during an emergency, just like a doctor would do during an emergency, to inform decisions and how we could change them moving forward. So your support for real-world evidence generation would be incredibly helpful.
So now we're going to move to our members based on seniority, and I think our next few are virtual. So just remind you to unmute if you don't do so on your own. I'll just keep reminding you. So next we have Mr. Rush from Illinois.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Last week, the Health Subcommittee held an informative hearing on the racial and ethnic health disparities being highlighted by the coronavirus. The statistics around these disparities are very troubling and even extremely outrageous. A Scientific American article published earlier this month found that and I quote, if black people were dying at the same rate as white Americans, at least 13,000 mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, and other loved ones would still be alive. Even more shocking is that among those 35 to 44 black men and women died from the coronavirus at least 9 times the rate of white Americans. Dr. Fauci, when it become apparent that institutional racism and structural discrimination are playing a part in why certain racial and ethnic communities are suffering more than white communities?
I think I know what I didn't hear it quite as clear as I want, but I think I know what the congressman is referring to. So when you're looking at the African American community and the minority community in general as a demographic group, there are two elements that make it much more difficult for them and why they're suffering disproportionately. One is the risk of infection. Because of economic and other considerations, the jobs that the majority of them would find themselves in does not allow them to protect themselves by looking into a computer and doing telework. Most of them are essential on outside, having to mingle in a society in which the virus is circulating. So right at the get-go, they have a greater risk of getting infected. And then we know from a lot of experience now that the situation regarding whether or not you have serious consequences, hospitalizations, intubation, complications, and death relate very strongly to the prevalence and incidence of underlying comorbid conditions, which are clearly disproportionately more expressed in the African American population than in the rest of the population. And that particularly includes hypertension, diabetes, obesity, chronic lung disease, and kidney disease. So unfortunately, we have a situation where it's sort of a double whammy of a negative capability of them to respond through no fault of their own because of underlying conditions and the conditions in which they find themselves with.
Dr. Fauci, would you consider racism itself as being one of the stresses that certainly impacts the African American community more in an extraordinary way that contributes to these comorbidities?
I think the question was, would I consider institutional racism as contributing? No, I don't think there's...
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Well, I mean, obviously, the African American community has suffered from racism for a very, very long period of time. And I cannot imagine that that has not contributed to the conditions that they find themselves in economically and otherwise. So the answer, Congressman, is yes.
Giroir, I applaud your announcement that provides for $100 million, for $40 million to go to the Morehouse College of Medicine for contact tracing and testing. I have introduced a bill, the TRACE Act, which calls for $100 million for testing and contact tracing. Should we be seeking a larger amount, $100 million or more for contact tracing and for testing?
Thank you, Congressman. For testing and contact tracing, we're going to need billions of dollars. I mean, that's the amounts of investment that we're doing partially through CDC. This specific award is to have Morehouse lead a consortium of organizations like 100 Black Men, UDUNOS US, the National Association of Community Health Workers, the National Council of Urban Indian Health, et cetera, to really focus on the specific educational, testing, and linkage to care needs of underserved minorities and some of those also in the rural population. My personal opinion is $40 million is a start. It's going to need to be a lot more than that in order to reach the people that we need to reach.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Admiral. Next is Mr. Upton from Michigan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and really appreciate the testimony that we've heard thus far and the interaction that we'll have between all of our I guess the first question I have, Dr. Fauci, good friend, thank you for your service for sure. In recent weeks, of course, you made the statement that you thought we would have as many as 100 million doses of an approved vaccine before the year. I've heard from a number of companies, again, just in recent days, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, hopes to have perhaps 1 billion doses before the end of next year, calendar year 21. So is that vaccine now moved through the phase 2 process, or maybe even get into some production a little bit later by somewhat early August? Not the approvals yet, but where things, because of the promise of getting it to the marketplace and really saving the world, let's face it. What is your thought as to how early we may see an EUA, an emergency use authorization, approved for any of these vaccines based on what you know today, and under scenarios that we may see something in the next number of months in terms of an approval? Lay out what you think is a real distinct possibility of where we might end up being.
Okay, thank you, Fred. I didn't hear
on as well.
I didn't hear everything you said, but I think I got enough of it to answer your question, at least the last part, that I think is very important, and I welcome the opportunity to address this. The idea about the doses that would be available, you know, a couple of 100 million doses in the beginning of the year, some companies saying that in a couple of years, a year or two, they'll have as many as 1 billion doses. I think that's real. Most people would raise their eyebrows and think that how is that going to happen? And it is because things are being done at risk. Companies are starting to plan to make doses even before you know the vaccine works. So the risk of the speed is not risk to safety, it's not risk to scientific integrity, it's risk to money. So put that aside. The point that Congressman Upton made, I think is very important. We need to be careful that we don't jump because of our need to get vaccines for those who need it, that we do not definitively prove safety and efficacy before we make decisions about distribution. We've heard a lot about emergency use authorization. An emergency use authorization is important, but it has to be done in a situation where you fulfill the criteria for the emergency use authorization. I would be very disappointed if we jumped to a conclusion before we knew that a vaccine was truly safe and truly effective, because I wouldn't want the perpetual ambiguity of not knowing whether or not it is truly safe and truly effective. That's the reason why we're doing several randomized placebo-controlled trials with power enough that could give us that answer. I hope that answers your question, Fred.
Well, just one quick, what would be the earliest that you think, under the best scenario, that we might be able to see an EUA issued by you all, along with, I guess it would actually be the FDA, right, that would actually issue that?
Yes, the answer is yes. Let me just quickly answer that and hand it over to Steve, because he may want to answer that. We're going into the first phase 3 efficacy trial in July. It takes at least a month to get to the second dose because it's a prime boost. You'll take another couple of months to accrue or enroll enough people that if there is viral activity in the community, and we have our sites not only in the United States, but all over the world, in Brazil and in South Africa. So if we get an efficacy signal, you're going to get an efficacy signal more quickly the more cases there are. Now, if it turns out that there are not a lot of cases, it may take longer. And that's the reason why you can't give an accurate prediction of when you're going to get those data. Steve, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Fauci. So just a couple of issues to your point, Congressman Upton. One is we are working with sponsors across the board, private industry, Operation Warp Speed, et cetera, those who are developing vaccines, and we're providing technical assistance regarding clinical trial design, the number of participants in the clinical trials, as well as the endpoints that we want to see to make an adjudication about safety and effectiveness. And I want to emphasize what Dr. Fauci said, and that is the acceleration is really around taking financial risk around the development process. The acceleration is not cutting corners with respect to the assessment of safety and effectiveness. The American people can rely upon the fact that FDA has many experts in the vaccine area. We've been doing this for years, and we will rely upon the science and data when it's available to us to make that adjudication and decision regarding an EUA. I cannot prejudge when that will happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Next, we have the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start with Dr. Redford. Doctor, we had a conversation on the weekend, and I expressed to you really my dismay, my disappointment about you as CDC director, the most prestigious institution in the world on infectious diseases and prevention. The United States today is number one in the world in infections and in deaths. This is not anything that any of us can be proud of. The American people are in pain, they're grieving, there's a great deal of sorrow in communities, there's confusion because for many reasons. And I urged you as head of CDC to speak directly to the American people. I know the agencies are talking to each other. I consider that a whisper because the American people are not hearing you speak out. They deserve to hear the truth. We have heard Dr. Fauci time and time again putting out trusted information to the American people. The American people are divided on this issue of the virus. Imagine that. So I continue to urge you to speak out. You're a doctor. Put your white jacket on and speak weekly to the American people. They want to know what's coming, what is ahead. My constituents ask me on a consistent basis, what's next? What is our government doing? That's a haunting question. And so while we're doing the nice back and forth this morning, good questions on the part of members, I really remain dismayed and deeply disappointed. We need leadership coming out of the CDC. Real leadership. It was an outrage that there was a gathering in Tulsa. 6 of the president's advance people were infected. And it's my understanding the 2 Secret Service agents were. How can the CDC allow this pandemic, this virus, to be something political? You have to push back. You're a scientist, you're a doctor. Now to Dr. Hahn, I'm sure you've read the several articles regarding hydroxychloroquine. Every study states it doesn't work in any setting. In fact, it has known side effects, cardiac issues being one. So there's a danger in terms of the side effects. As commissioner, you see all the data. Are you going to inform the American people, doctors across the country, about these facts?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. And indeed, we are. I can refer the committee to several documents that we have put out over the last several weeks regarding hydroxychloroquine. With respect to the issues, we issued a safety alert, particularly around the combination of hydroxychloroquine with other drugs that might affect the heart. And as you know, we've taken recent action regarding the EUA.
Have you specifically spoken directly to the American people so there isn't this confusion about hydroxychloroquine?
Yes, ma'am. There is an FDA Voices piece that's authored by me, as well as a piece that's directly to the American people about the status of
That's on
hydroxychloroquine.
paper. I want to know if you have spoken out verbally to the American people, to doctors across the country. People don't hear paper, with all due respect.
Yes, ma'am, and I appreciate the question, but every opportunity I've had to be in the media, I've been asked that question, and I have communicated that same information about the current status.
I have another question, Dr. Hahn. There have been several disturbing articles expressing concerns relative to political pressure being placed on the FDA by the White House. Will you state unequivocally that if any political pressure is applied to you and the FDA, that you will immediately report that to this committee?
I will certainly unequivocally state that if I receive political pressure, I will report to this committee. I can tell you that I have not felt political pressure, nor has the FDA, to make any decision in any specific direction.
Thank
Well,
you.
it's not about feelings. It's about a direct political pressure. So thank you for your response, and we'll go back.
Thank you, Ms. Heshu. Next is Mr. Latta from Ohio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses and all the hard work that you've been doing over the last several months for not only the United States, but for individuals from around the world. Greatly appreciate it. Dr. Fauci, if I could start my questions with you. And I know that our leader, Mr. Walden, had brought some of this up. Would you further explain how an infected individual develops antibodies and how long those antibodies remain effective in fighting off the virus? And are you seeing different levels of antibodies in people who have been infected, and what that means in terms of immunity?
Thank you very much for that question, Congressman Latta. So we need to start off by saying that we want to assume you're dealing with an antibody test that's been validated by the FDA or by the NIH. That's important because a lot of the confusion out there are tests that are not validated. But let's assume you have a good test. Whenever the body gets confronted with a virus and recovers, even when they don't recover, the body is stimulated to make antibodies. In general, for viruses that we have a lot of experience with, those antibodies serve to protect you against exposure and infection after you're exposed to the same virus. So that's what we call immunological memory, and these proteins block the virus. The one thing we do not know yet with COVID-19 is the relationship between the type of antibody, because the best antibody is called neutralizing antibody. Namely, if this were the virus, and this is where the virus binds to the cell, the neutralizing antibody blocks the virus from binding to the cell. There are antibodies against other parts of the virus that are called binding antibodies. They don't mean much. So you got to make sure you get the right antibody. The second thing is, what we still don't know is what the relationship between the titer of the antibody is, namely the level of the antibody and the degree of protection. The third thing we don't know is how long or what the duration of that antibody is going to be. We're going to find these things out as we study these individuals over months and a year or more. But remember, we're only a few months into this. So A, we know they make antibody. B, it's likely that they're protected for some period of time, but we don't know how long that's going to be. So the question I always get asked, which is a subtext, does that mean if you're exposed and you have antibody that you're protected? Likely you are, but we don't know how long you are protected.
All right, well, thank you. Dr. Redfield, excuse me, when a vaccine or treatment is developed, how will it be distributed to Americans?
Thank you for the question. It's a critical issue that is currently under discussion within the team to look at what the appropriate prioritization for distribution is. I want to just comment that it may be very dependent on what the product is. Each of these vaccine products that are currently being developed may in fact have differential utilization for different populations. So there is serious consideration to try to develop those prioritizations, and it's going to be important to develop them dependent on the product that they're going to be applied to.
Thank you. Dr. Hahn, and thanks very much for all your work, and thanks for taking my calls, especially on Friday nights and on Saturdays. I appreciate it. The FDA provided an emergency use authorization for remdesivir. Do you expect or envision the FDA to issue any more EUAs for potential treatments in the fall?
Congressman, for potential therapies, is that what you asked, sir?
Right.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So we are working very closely with sponsors regarding the development of therapeutics, including with Operation Warp Speed. 131 clinical trials ongoing right now. I anticipate that we will receive data regarding several therapies in the future, plasma being one of them, what we just discussed with Congressman Walden, potentially also with some anti-inflammatory agents, as well as for monoclonal antibodies. Those are being accelerated through the pipeline and are potential therapeutics as well as prophylaxis moving forward. Again, can't prejudge the EUA process because we have to see the data, but I do anticipate that we will be receiving data.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we have Ms. DeGette from Colorado.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel and welcome all of you. Many of you have appeared in front of my subcommittee, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, a number of times. And just to let you know, the O&I subcommittee is going to be continuing its investigations, both about how we responded to this and where we go in the future. So you can expect to hear from us. I have some brief questions for each witness, and I'd like to start with you, Admiral Giroir. The chairman talked about the president's comments last weekend, saying that it's a double-edged sword testing, because when you do testing, quote, you're going to find more people. And then again this morning, the president tweeted, cases are going up in the U.S. because we are testing far more than any other country and ever expanding. With smaller testing, we would show further cases. This is what he says. And he also said this morning that he doesn't joke about these things. So I know the chairman asked Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redford, they've been instructed to test less. I'm going to ask you, since you are now in charge of overseeing the tests, has the president asked you to do fewer tests?
Thank you. And again, I want to clarify that neither the
yes or no will work. Yes or no will work, Admiral. Has
no,
the president has
neither the president nor anyone in the administration has instructed or suggested that we should do less testing, have said that to me, and we are proceeding in just the opposite. We want to do more testing of higher quality.
I want to ask you, Admiral, do you think that it's a good or a bad idea to do less testing so it will look like we have fewer cases?
My purpose in leading is to increase the number of testing. The only way that we will be able to understand who has the disease, who is infected and can pass it, and to do appropriate contact tracing is to test appropriately, smartly, and as many people as we can.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fauci, I wanted to ask you, I've seen some data the last few days that while cases are going up in this country, deaths are going down. And I've seen some reporting in the media that in part that's because younger people who tend to not to die from COVID are the ones being infected. Should we see this as a positive sign, or should we still be worried?
I think it's too early to make that kind of link, Congresswoman. Let me explain. Deaths always lag considerably behind cases. You might remember that at the time that New York was in their worst situation, where the deaths were going up, and yet the cases were starting to go down. The deaths only came down multiple weeks later. So you're seeing more cases now while the deaths are going down. The concern is if those cases then infect people who wind up getting sick and go to the hospital, it is conceivable you may see the deaths going up. So I think it's too early to say because the deaths are going down.
Thank you, Doctor. And I have another question, Dr. Fauci, for you. We've seen, and I think you and I have talked about this, most vaccines take years, if not decades, to be approved and be proved efficacious. And sometimes we don't find a vaccine at all. I have two questions for you. Number one, do you believe that we will find a vaccine for the coronavirus? And number two, do you still stand by the prediction you gave us some months ago that we could actually have a vaccine by early 2021?
I feel cautiously optimistic, Congresswoman, that we will be successful in getting a vaccine. There's never a guarantee of that, but the early data that we're seeing regarding the immunogenicity and the induction of good responses makes me cautiously optimistic, always knowing that there's never a guarantee. You remember I told your committee a few months ago that a vaccine would be available from a year to 18 months. I said that in January of 2020. A year from January is December. I still think there is a reasonably good chance that by the very beginning of 2021, that if we're going to have a vaccine, that we will have it by then.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Next, we have Mrs. Rogers from Washington State. I hope.
I'm coming. Kathy McMorris Rogers is here. Am I here?
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for holding this hearing and appreciate our witnesses for testifying today. COVID-19 is the challenge of the century, as others have said. It's a health and economic crisis of our lifetime. We mourn the deaths of over 100,000 Americans, and we must remember that we're not out of the woods yet. I want to especially express my heartfelt gratitude for the healthcare workers, the first responders, the emergency and essential workers who have been working around the clock to fight this virus, save lives, and keep our families safe. As our experts work tirelessly to develop a vaccine and treatment, I'm confident that there's no country in the world who's better equipped to lead for a medical breakthrough than America. We can't trust China to lead. And that's why the Trump administration has created programs like Operation Warp Speed. We're bringing together the very best in the public and private sector to develop countermeasures that will fight the virus. We're leveraging the power of artificial intelligence, supercomputing, and machine learning to speed up discoveries and enhance our knowledge base of the virus. In Washington State, we have top researchers as well as biotech and pharmaceutical innovators who continue to be at the forefront of these breakthroughs. I look forward to learning more and appreciate all of you being here to understand what the administration is continuing to do to lead in the development of these tests and treatments that America needs so that we can usher in a new era of innovation and healthcare cures. To win the future, keep our families healthy and save lives, and to ensure our economy booms again, we must get this right. Dr. Fauci, as you know, adjuvants maximize the effectiveness of vaccines. Would you just explain a little bit further what an adjuvant is? And are there any novel synthetic adjuvants in the pipeline? And if so, how will they play a role in the administration's pursuit of a COVID-19 vaccine?
Thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. An adjuvant is a product distinct from the vaccine itself, but when given in conjunction with the vaccine, it enhances the power of the immune response. So if you have a vaccine that gives a level of response that here, when you get an adjuvant together with it, you often boost it to a much higher level. We use adjuvants in several vaccines. The NIH has a major program in the pursuit and development of novel adjuvants of all different types. And in fact, that's part of the program right now to accelerate our vaccine development capability. So it's a good question, but it's a very important part of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Hahn, as you know, FDA's decentralization of diagnostic test oversight has been very helpful in expanding the availability of diagnostic tests for COVID-19, but it's temporary. Would you just speak to how this flexibility has benefited the general public and how you think it would be helpful in the future for outbreaks or novel viruses?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Appreciate the question. As you pointed out, the flexibilities have allowed us to work with test developers. This has been throughout the COVID pandemic, with all of our medical products, a balance between the oversight so that we have tests that are valid, reproducible, accurate, but at the same time allow the developers the ability to have the freedom to develop those tests. And we've developed this partnership that I think has been very fruitful moving forward. I particularly like it with respect to the flexibility given the states, your state in particular, which has an excellent public health laboratories, as well as University of Washington, and New York State's another example of this. Those are the sort of things that we're looking at now as we talk about how we want to move forward, that we could potentially put in place on a permanent basis to facilitate test development. Hopefully we'll never be in a position again where we have to develop tests over such a short period of time like we've remarkably done during this time. But we really do need to talk about how these flexibilities could stimulate innovation and development of tests.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for your leadership, your commitment during this time, the long hours, and I especially appreciate the way that we're looking forward to make sure that we are prepared in the future of whatever we may face. Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Now we go to Mr. Doyle, coming to us from Pittsburgh. Mr. Doyle? Is Mr. Doyle?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I forgot to unmute.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and the ranking member also, and to our witnesses for your service on behalf of the American people. This committee has continued to conduct oversight of the Trump administration's shortcomings related to procuring and distributing personal protective equipment, or PPE. When states and hospitals were faced with critical shortages of PPE, such as masks and gowns, President Trump passed the buck and said the federal government was, quote, not a shipping clerk. We saw the result of a failure of leadership. Without a national strategy, states have had to fend for themselves and even compete against each other for critical supplies. It's become so desperate out there that one former U.S. disaster official referred to this scramble as, quote, Lord of the Flies PPE edition. At a recent hearing before the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer testified, quote, the lack of centralized coordination at the federal level created a counterproductive competition between the states and federal government to secure limited supplies, driving up prices and exacerbating existing shortages. Admiral Giroir, let me ask you, do we have enough PPE for every frontline worker who needs it, whether they be healthcare workers, first responders, or thousands of others whose job puts them at risk, or people still having to reuse N95 masks, for example? And if we don't have enough, why hasn't the administration invoked DPA to greatly expand the manufacturing of these supplies?
Well, thank you for the question. And I will do my best to answer that. Admiral Polubchek is certainly running the supply chain with also Dr. Kadlec from ASPR. But being a member of the Unified Coordination Group at FEMA for the past 3 months, I'm pretty familiar with this. I think as Admiral Polubchek testified before, and I think we all know, is that there was an absolute shortage of everything when this started. Everyone in the world was looking for the same supplies, and we tried to manage that both from increasing the supplies and using the DPA multiple times. For example, there were 3 investments, DPA Title I for N95s, 3M, Honeywell, and Owens & Minor, to improve production. We estimate that the country in the fall, if there were a COVID outbreak to this degree, would need about 140 million N95s per month. We should have 180 million per month being produced domestically by that time. This was not available when we started in March. The industry was not here. This was all offshored. And I'll just say cumulatively between March 1st and June 19th, the government distributed or enabled the commercial distribution through the air bridge of 160 million N95 masks, 638 million surgical and procedural masks, 281 million gowns, and over 16 billion pairs of gloves. So this was really an enormous effort. We need to be better prepared. This all needs to be onshore. We're working with SNS 2.0 to have a 60 to 90-day supply. We talked to governors in every state. Many of the states are also doing their own supplies for 60 to 90 days. So I'm confident moving from here on as we ramp domestic manufacturing that we're going to be in a much better position than we were 3 months ago.
Thank you, Admiral. Dr. Hahn, let me ask you, since demand for PPE increased this spring, we've seen many actors with little previous experience in the supply field enter the market. Reports have indicated that some are selling counterfeit or low-quality products that don't meet safety requirements or unable to fulfill agreements. What steps is the FDA taking to ensure that companies are not circumventing federal oversight and injecting potentially substandard PPE into the United States market?
Thank you, Congressman. This is a really important issue. During the height of this epidemic and the increased demand, we provided regulatory flexibility for companies, but insisted that they provide certification, often foreign FDAs, if you will, certification that the PPE met the requirements that we have in place and that the foreign governments had in place. But we did something else with respect to that, and that is we also partnered with CDC and NIOSH, for example, with N95s, to test, to verify that, in fact, that self-certification over the validity of the efficacy of the PPE was in place. And you've correctly identified that for a variety of reasons, subsequent product that was shipped into the country did not meet those specifications. We immediately took action to make sure that those were off of the market and continue to do that and monitor it very closely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Next, we have Mr. Guthrie coming to us from Kentucky. Are you muted? Do you want to unmute?
I thought I did that. I apologize. Hi, Brett Guthrie. I apologize. Hi, Dr. Hahn. Dr. Hahn, I'm interested in the COVID-19 counterfeit testing, and I have a bill that would bring. It's called the Safeguarding Therapeutics Act that would ensure FDA has the authority to destroy the counterfeit tests and devices. And I'll follow up with a question with this. What I'm interested in, what the people that I talk to every day are interested in is what's going on in the future. How are we going to protect ourselves moving forward? We need to lessons learned from the past. We need to look forward. And Dr. Hahn kind of answered on, Admiral Giroir answered on the PPE kind of moving forward. But if I could just go with Dr. Redford, Dr. Fauci, and then Dr. Hahn, if you'll talk about pool testing and how that might be effective. Well, the people that I talk to want to know what's it going to look like in March? What's it going to look like in August? Are kids going to be getting back in school? Are nursing homes going to be safe? That's what people are looking for. So, Dr. Redenfield, I know we're going to have flu, we're going to have COVID. What's the testing going to be like? Dr. Fauci, what do we need to be looking for in Dr. Hahn pool testing? And I'll just open it up for you three to talk about what's it going to look like in August, and are kids going to be able to go back to school? Thinking I'll start with Dr. Redenfield.
Thank you, Congressman. I think first and foremost, it's really important that we continue to take this time to continue to accelerate our capacity to diagnose obviously readily available timely test results, build that capacity for isolation, contact tracing, and self-quarantine. That's fundamental. We're working hard to do that. As I mentioned, in January, we had about 6,000 contact tracers in this country. At the beginning of June, it was up to around 28,000. It needs to continue to increase, in my view, towards 100,000, and we get that operationally functional. That's going to be critical for what we're doing. Secondly, we do have to reinforce in the American public the importance of the social distancing interventions that we've discussed, particularly face covering, 6 feet distancing, and hand washing. I anticipate that the states will begin to open up higher education and K through 12. It's going to be on a jurisdiction to jurisdiction decision. CDC will be issuing additional guidance on this topic in the days ahead as we continue to try to work and give guidance how to open up these, particularly the school systems, how to open them up safely. I will end with nursing homes. I think we've made an enormous progress in the long-term care facilities, enhancing infection control. Admiral Giroir may want to comment about the commitment that FEMA made to provide all nursing homes protective equipment for a period of time. And we're continuing, I think, to have aggressive surveillance in the nursing homes across this country, where we've recommended that all residents get tested so that we can start with a clean baseline of understanding where the epidemic is. I will just end with the fact that although they only make up 0.6% of our population, nursing home residents have made up more than 35% of our mortality.
Let me very briefly.
Thank you, Dr. Redenfield.
Yeah.
Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, let me briefly address the question you asked about schools, because we get asked that all the time. I think the important thing to point out is that, as you well know, we live in a very big country that is certainly not a unidimensional country. It's very, very different, whether you're in a New York metropolitan area or Casper, Wyoming. So when you're asking about schools, you have to say, where are you talking about? Because we have different regions, different states, different cities, towns, and counties. So some counties may have such a low level of infection that schools can open in a way that's exactly like normal. Others may be in a situation where it isn't really bad where you want to close the school, but you might want to make some modifications, alterations of scheduling, things like morning, afternoon, one day or another day. So it's up to the local officials to evaluate where you are in the particular region, what the recommendations that we really very carefully put out about the guidance of opening schools. So you don't want to make one size fits all for the United States. You want to tailor it to the degree of viral dynamics in the particular location that you're talking about.
So looking forward, we're really only going to know when we get closer to that point, so we can make those decisions. That's unfortunate, but obviously the reality. I'm about out of time, Dr. Hahn. I'll submit a question for the record for pool sampling. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie. It sounded like there was a monster that was going to envelop you at some point there. Next, we have Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses. I have to disagree with you, Dr. Redfield. I think nowhere has the Trump administration's lack of leadership been more apparent than in our nation's nursing homes and long-term care facilities, where we've lost 50,000 residents and workers to COVID-19. So let's review some of the deadly failures. You delayed data collection on cases and deaths in nursing homes. You have not required states to conduct testing. You are not giving workers adequate PPE, and I agree with Congressman Doyle on that, to protect themselves. You are allowing facilities to literally kick residents out onto the street if there's a more profitable COVID patient to take their place. And since CMS Administrator Vermont, who is responsible for the safety of our nursing home residents, has declined Chairman Pallone's invitation to speak, let me refer then to Dr. Redfield. The CDC website explains that your mission is to save lives by providing health information that protects our nation. So why didn't you require nursing homes to report any data on COVID-19 cases and deaths until May, 4 months after, you may remember, you told me about the first case in Illinois, January 30th, and to report the case of human-to-human transfer. On June 4th, you testified before the House Appropriations Committee and apologized for CDC's inadequate, I quote, response to COVID-19 race and ethnicity data. Yet, the same day, CMS and CDC finally published COVID-19 data from nursing homes and failed to include race and ethnicity information. So when my office asked CMS about the exclusion, we were told to ask the CDC. So will you promise to include race and ethnicity information moving forward so that we can identify and address the racial disparities in nursing home COVID-19 cases?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. First, I want to stress that since the early beginning of the pandemic, we've initially encouraged all nursing homes to report the cases through their health departments and through our National Healthcare Safety Network as of May 8th.
If I could just briefly interrupt on the word encourage. That, I think, is a problem, that there's been guidance, there's been encouragement, but what about mandating?
As I said, that as of May 8th now, it is a requirement that this be reported in through CDC, as CMS has made that required. And we are working to make sure this reporting is comprehensive to include ethnic and racial data. As well as I would put forth that we've worked hard to really accelerate training and retraining of infection control procedures in these nursing homes to try to mitigate the situation that unfortunately we did experience, as you pointed out, where the nursing home residents have taken a high burden of this initial outbreak. We will continue to work to get this reporting. This reporting is going to be forward-facing. CDC will forward the data to CMS. CMS will forward-face it so families can make decisions based on their understanding of how different nursing homes are performing. We have recommended that the nursing homes, as you mentioned, that they screen all residents, and we've recommended that they screen all workers in nursing homes on a weekly basis because we do believe this is an important area that we have to do more as a nation to protect infections.
And let me just say, this kind of suggesting and recommending has clearly not been enough, in my view. This is the view of many observers, families, workers, that there is a crisis in our nursing homes, that it persists, and that we insist that the government do more to help. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Olson of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone and leading Republican member Greg Walden, for having this very important hearing. Welcome to our 4 expert witnesses. Y'all have been on the front lines fighting the COVID-19 virus for about half a year now. We greatly appreciate all your efforts to make our country safer. And a special howdy to a former Rice Owl like myself, Commissioner Hahn. Go Owls. First of all of you know that Texas and Greater Houston have seen a spike in COVID-19 cases over the last week. Our state is at stage 3 of reopening, and the trend is not good. The Dr. Tony Fauci of Houston, of Texas, Dr. Peter Hotez, put out a tweet, and I quote what he said: "If this trajectory persists, Houston will be the worst affected city in the United States, maybe rival what we're seeing right now in Brazil," end quote. And that is damn scary. The spike in the Greater Houston region is due to one county, Harris County, which is the third largest county in America, and the county seat of Harris County in Houston, county seat of Houston, the 4th largest seat. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have a graph entered for the record about the spikes in Houston, in Harris County, in Fort Bend County, Missouri County.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. There's many factors why we're having a spike right now in Texas and in Houston. But what scares me the most is the increase in infections cases from people aged 20 to 39, the so-called youngsters. The last week, there are 1/3 of the new cases in my hometown of Sugar Land, in my home county of Fort Bend, in the Greater Houston region. This is because of their attitude. To sum up their attitude, my former boss Phil Graham said it best about these people, how they view this crisis. Bending the COVID-19 curve and ending the pandemic is like going to heaven. Everyone wants to go there, but fewer and fewer want to do the hard work to make it happen. I call this the bad attitude curve. And Dr. Fauci, if you were king for a day, how can we change this bad attitude curve and make these people address this issue for the threat it truly is?
Well, Congressman, you bring up a very good point. One of the very perplexing things about COVID-19, and I've, as some of you know, I've been dealing with viral outbreaks for the last 40 years. I've never seen a single virus that is one pathogen have a range from 20 to 40% of the people have no symptoms, to some get mild symptoms, to some get symptoms enough to put them at home for a few days. Some are in bed for weeks and have symptoms even after they recover. Others go to the hospital. Some require oxygen. Some require intensive care. Some get intubated and some die. So you have a situation that is very confusing to people because some people think it's trivial, it doesn't bother me, who cares? And that's one of the reasons why what we do have is a lack of appreciation, that you have a dual responsibility. You have a responsibility to yourself, because I think thinking that young people have no deleterious consequences is not true. We're seeing more and more complications in young people. But even though the majority, the overwhelming majority of them do well, what you can't forget is that if you get infected and spread the infection, even though you do not get sick, you are part of the process of the dynamics of an outbreak. And what you might be propagating inadvertently, perhaps innocently, is infecting someone who then infects someone who then is someone who's vulnerable. That could be your grandmother, your grandfather, your sick uncle, whom have you, who winds up dying. So it's a very difficult messaging when people say, I'm young, I'm healthy, who cares? You should care, not only for yourself, but for the impact that you might have on the dynamics of the outbreak.
The bad attitude syndrome. I'm out of time. I have a question for the record for Dr. Redfield about hurricane evacuations of COVID-19 people from nursery homes. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Next, we go to Mr. Butterfield from North Carolina. You might have to unmute, GK.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I made a note to do that and failed to do it. Yes, but thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses today. Mr. Chairman, in response to COVID-19, Congress has appropriated significant funding through the CARES Act. And it looks like some of that money is finally getting into underserved communities. The Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, led by Congresswoman Robin Kelly, has met with some or all of you, and we've written you to urge funding for minority institutions and communities to fight the pandemic. Admiral, Mr. Secretary, you announced this morning that HHS has formed a partnership with the Morehouse School of Medicine. That's good. A partnership to coordinate a strategic network of organizations to deliver COVID-19 related information to minority communities hardest hit by the pandemic. Does the Morehouse funding give the medical school discretion to engage in aggressive contact tracing and other testing and education? We need more than information. What is their mandate?
So thank you for that question, sir. The intent of this award is really not to empower Morehouse to physically do contact tracing themselves, but to be a lead institution to build partnerships throughout the nation so that public health organizations, et cetera, can use the well over $11 billion that the CDC sent out. So we are not funding Morehouse to be the boots on the ground. We're funding them to be the brains behind the operation, to really extend our network throughout the minority and underserved.
Yes, thank you for that. But how broad is their discretion, or are they restricted?
They be happy to get into this, but they assembled really a remarkable group of partners using digital technologies, all types of network technologies. They have very broad discretion. This is out of my office. And look, what I want to do is make sure that the underserved get the information, get testing, and get linked to care.
That's what I wanted to hear, broad discretion. Dr. Fauci, the Washington Post reported this morning that Arizona is seeing a troubling spike, the state of Arizona. And as we all know, President Trump is in Phoenix today for a campaign rally at Dream City Church. And I suspect he will not be wearing a mask. I know that will disappoint you. It will certainly disappoint me. The Washington Post also reported that Arizona got its positive rate down to 7%, but now it's up to 20% after a 3-week rise. In my state of North Carolina, we got it down to 7%, and now in North Carolina, it's up to 10%. So 10% in North Carolina, up from 7%, and 20% in Arizona. What is the administration specifically doing to slow the spread in states like Arizona and North Carolina that are seeing a rise? It just can't be explained away by more testing.
Well, Congressman, the percentages that you're speaking of are clearly indication that there are additional infections that are responsible for those increases, because when you get an increase in the percentage of your tests that are positive, that's an indication that you do have additional infections. So one of the issues that we've spoken about that's very clear is that when you have those kinds of increases, you must implement on the ground as effectively as possible the manpower, the system, the tests to do identification, isolation, and contact tracing to try and blunt that surge of cases in the 2 states that you're speaking of. Hopefully that will be successful in the blunting of those cases, because if not, then you have the danger of having a gradual, insidious increase in community spread, which will be much more difficult to contain as the community spread amplifies itself.
Well, it just seems to me, in closing, Dr. Fauci, and you don't need to respond to this, but it seems to me that the president seems to think that COVID is over and he can just push it all to the states. The data that's coming out of the state shows the necessity, the absolute necessity for a national strategy, because while the virus may seem contained in some areas, it is conceivable that we can see a resurgence everywhere. This frightens me and should frighten the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Butterfield. So now Dr. Burgess is here, and we'll recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, I was with you virtually earlier, so I heard all the discussion back and forth, and I would ask unanimous consent that my opening statement be made part of the record. And I do want to thank our panelists for being here today. Outside of a tiny little bit that we tacked onto a budget hearing on February 27th, we really have not heard from this group enough in this committee, and certainly the Health Subcommittee. So I want to thank you for your willingness to be here today and testify. I'd also observe that we're about the 1-year anniversary of the passage and signing of the Pandemic All-Hazard Preparedness Act. We had a wonderful opportunity in January, February, perhaps early March of this year to do some real-time introspection as to whether or not that bill had gotten things right. Did we do was it performing as intended? Was it going as expected? And for whatever reason, we chose to talk about flavored tobacco, horse racing, and ticket stubs instead. So we can be critical of the administration, Mr. Chairman, but this committee bears some of that responsibility as well. Since we've been talking about community spread, an increase in community spread, I also, Dr. Fauci, have been talking to some of my counterparts, physicians in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and spread in that part near the border of Mexico. Community spread has been apparently significant over the last week to 10 days. I guess the question I would have for you and for Admiral Giroir is, since we recognize community spread is increasing and we recognize that there's still going to be the vulnerabilities of congregate living facilities, what are we doing to make certain that the appropriate amount of personal protective equipment is available to our congregate living facilities, extended care facilities, and nursing homes, not just in the Valley, but any place where we see this community spread increasing?
So, thank you, Dr. Burgess. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Again, I am familiar with the PPE situation from my work on the UCG at FEMA, and I think you know that it was decided by the UCG very early that when we were able to secure the PPE, we would send directly to and we're sending PPE directly to 15,000, I believe the number is 400 nursing homes. And the numbers are really staggering. Millions of face shields, masks, 13 million pairs of gloves already there. So that's being distributed right now. And there are going to be multiple tranches of that. Again, Admiral Polubchak is running this through the supply chain task force. I've got all the swabs and all the tests. He runs the PPE and we interact a lot. So that's going to be going all the way through August and September through all 15,400 nursing homes with multiple shipments of that.
Do you agree that that is on the immediate horizon ahead? That's one of the big vulnerabilities. Community spread is increasing in some places, but we also know we've got areas where there's congregate living, people with multiple risk factors.
So I think as maybe been said by the colleagues, we are clearly seeing community spread in a number of areas. If you look at counties, I think Dr. Birx detailed yesterday that there are about 110 counties of real concern throughout the country.
Well, I guess, Admiral, excuse me for interrupting, but my time is short. I guess what I'm really asking is, are we preparing, and do our administrators and executives in nursing home facilities, know how to access the vast amounts of personal protective equipment that's being made available through AirBridge and through the work you've done? Because if we don't get it to the end user, then it's a vulnerability, and it will affect all of us.
Very briefly, because I know the time, I'm going to say the answer is yes, because we decided to ship door to door because we couldn't necessarily rely on the state distribution systems, because you just can't get that deep. So the only way to do it is get the address and ship it. And then secondly, the testing regimens that are now mandated through CMS, recommended by CDC, are pretty excellent, right? Every nursing home resident gets tested, every worker gets tested every week. This is a very robust testing regimen that we think is going to put high protection.
Certainly has been in Texas. Dr. Redfield, in just a very brief amount of time I have remaining, let me just ask you a question. We heard some things, and of course people are concerned about China and the impact that China has had on our ability to fight this virus. Are there people working in the CDC in Atlanta who are Chinese nationalists? Do you have such people on loan from Chinese labs in the agency?
Well, CDC does have an office. CDC has an office in Beijing that is right next to the China CDC, and we work collaboratively on a series of things, particularly respiratory viruses and particularly influenza. We haven't been brought into the overall Chinese investigation of this current coronavirus epidemic. It's something I requested back on January 3rd and informally on January 6th.
All right. I want to be helpful to you on that, so I will follow up with you, and I have some ideas of some other things that we might think about as well, but I think that's a critical part of our discussion going forward and being prepared into the future. So thank you. I'll take the panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Next, we go to Ms. Matsui in California. May have to unmute.
Thank you.
Oh.
I have unmuted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to also thank the witnesses for being here today. You've been on the clock 24/7. We really appreciate it. Now, while a lot of our questions today have focused on how we found ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, I'd like to focus my questions on the future and how we are preparing for the coming weeks and months and the possibility of another dramatic surge in cases of a second wave this fall, particularly during flu season. Dr. Fauci, it's nice to see you there. You have said that we are still in the wave, and I understand that it's difficult to predict what a second wave would look like while we're still seeing high case counts and deaths currently. However, we must effectively prepare our communities, our healthcare workforce, and constituents for what could come as we make decisions about returning to work, going to school, and trying to readjust to what we consider somewhat normal life. Dr. Fauci, I want you to put your kind of prognosticator cap on right now. What are the projected infection mortality rates for the second half of 2020 and for early 2021?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It is really impossible to give any projection about what the fatality rate or case rates are going to be. It's going to depend on so many factors. I think you alluded to that in the beginning of your question when people talk about second waves, and I have said multiple times publicly that we are still in the middle of the first wave. So before you start talking about what a second wave is, what we'd like to do is to get this outbreak under control over the next couple of months so that when we enter into the fall, early, late, and then early winter, that we have such a low baseline that when you do have the inevitable situation of cases appearing as you try to gradually reopen the country, which we're all trying to do to varying degrees depending upon what state, city, town, or county you're in, that if you get a level that's very low, when you get new cases, you can contain. And contain means identify, isolate, and contact trace, rather than have such a high level that when you get increases, you have to mitigate right from the beginning. So that really, as you can imagine, complicates the situation and makes it impossible to predict what the case or fatality rate is going to be until you know where you are. Do you get down to baseline? And if so, can you keep it there as you enter into the complicating situation that will inevitably occur when we get into the winter, and inevitably we will have a flu season. And that's the reason why we were saying, all of us, why it's so important to really get as many people vaccinated with influenza as you possibly can, so that you can at least take off the table for many people one of the confounding issues that we're going to face this winter of 2 respiratory-borne infections simultaneously confounding each other.
Now, what would you say, Dr. Fauci, understanding that we don't know yet, but we have a sense that we are going to have a second wave? What should the public know so they can be prepared for this? And what, as a country, can we all do to reduce the potential for this second wave, somehow or another to manage it? Because I think that all of us believe something is going to be happening, and we need to know what we can do now.
Thank you for that second part of the question. There are a lot of things that can be done. We know what the failings were early on. A lack of enough PPE, a lack of enough N95s, hospital bed issues, ventilator issues. All that is right now being stored up in the Strategic National Stockpile in preparation for what we hope never occurs, but which very well might occur. So it's the preparation. Also, as Admiral Giroir had mentioned, as we go into the fall, we likely will have the capability of doing 40 to 50 million tests per month, which means we can get a much better grasp of what the situation is of the dynamics of virus in the community. So hopefully we will be much better prepared if, in fact, we do get this second surge, and we were months ago.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Fauci, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Next, we move to Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to direct my first question to Dr. Fauci. The New York Times, CNN, and Washington Post have relentlessly criticized President Trump's response to COVID-19, calling it a failure. You heard today, a lack of leadership. But wait, as you know, nearly 750,000 people have died in America from drug overdose, and we still don't have a solution. AIDS has killed over 700,000 people in America, and we don't have a cure for that either. But look, the first case of COVID was diagnosed in America just 155 days ago. And according to testimony we had earlier this spring, the pharmaceutical experts say that we could have a treatment by fall and a vaccine by January. Keeping in mind, it took almost 10 years to come up with a vaccine for the influenza and 4 years for mumps. Nevertheless, the media and the left simply can't help but criticize President Trump. So my question to you is, do you think that President Trump is being judged fairly?
No, actually, that's an unfair question, because you're asking me to pass judgment on the press's treating of the President of the United States. That's, I mean,
it may be unfair, but numerous times you've commented and criticized or contradicted what the president says. So do you think he's being judged fairly?
Well, it depends on what you mean. I mean, I work in the White House, and I believe that everyone there is doing everything they possibly can to do what they need to do.
So, Dr. Fauci, you said as late, and I got a newspaper article that as late as March 31st, there was no consensus on wearing masks. And the president, as you know, relies on your expertise. Do you now regret not advising people more forcefully to wear masks earlier?
Okay, we're going to play that game. Let me explain to you what happened back then.
Should be a yes or a no.
No, there's more than a yes or no by the tone of your question. I don't regret that, because let me explain to you what happened. At that time, there was a paucity of equipment that our healthcare providers needed, who put themselves daily in harm's way of taking care of people who are ill. We did not want to divert masks and PPE away from them to be used by the people.
Okay,
now that we have enough, we recommend.
I've got 2 more questions, so thank you for that, Dr. Fauci. So, Dr. Redfield, I'm going to be directing this to you. Nursing homes, as we've talked about here earlier, make up nearly 90 or 40% of all the COVID deaths. And the CDC issued guidance on proper protocol for these facilities. Yet states like Michigan, New York, New Jersey, and California apparently disregarded that guidance. So, Dr. Redfield, do you think the decisions of these governors led to unnecessary deaths in these nursing homes?
Thank you for your question. I think the critical issue here is two things. One, our guidance is just that, guidance. Two, areas that we could impact the nursing homes, particularly in the infection control, working together with CMS very aggressively early on after the Seattle outbreak was recognized in that nursing home, really rechanneled energy into looking at the effectiveness of infection control in those nursing homes. Then restricted visitors to make sure.
Do you think that the decisions led to unnecessary deaths by allowing infected residents to come back into the nursing home?
I think, again, all of these decisions that have been made in the early days are subject to hindsight. We gave clear guidance on how people should be handled if they come into these nursing homes.
Okay, good. Now, the third question, back again to you, Dr. Redford. We know in the foreseeable future that we're not going to have a zero risk of transmission. We're not going to get to that. So if we want our economy to recover, we know our schools have to reopen. So going back to the school question, in addition to tracing, distancing, wearing masks, what rate of infection is needed in your mindset for children to go back to school? What's the rate of infection? 1%?
Yeah, I'm not prepared to give you that definitive answer. I am prepared to say that one of the most important things we need to look at is not the number of infections, but the consequences of these infections. And there's two really big consequences. One is hospitalization and mortality, and the other is our economy, right? And I think we're clearly seeing that in many parts of our nation that one can open our economy safely, but it is going to require more vigilance than some of us see right now with the social distancing. We're going to continue to try to emphasize the importance of social distancing, face mask, and hand washing as we continue to do it. It's my expectations that many jurisdictions will be opening schools. We're going to try to give the guidance to help them do it safely. I think you're right, as Dr. Fauci alluded to before. It is going to be influenced by the kinetics of the outbreak in the jurisdiction at the time. I'm not prepared to give you that number, but I think we're going to see progressive jurisdictions move to open schools in the fall.
Yield back. My time's up.
We now go to Ms. Castor, the gentlewoman from Florida. I'd ask everybody to unmute before they begin.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to our witnesses today. When you compare the number of confirmed cases and the number of deaths in the United States with countries across the globe, it's really shocking. And it makes me angry and it makes me sad at the same time. We have 2.3 million confirmed cases. We have just over 120,000 Americans who have lost their lives just in a few months' time. And it appears that other countries have done a better job of controlling the spread. They've done a better job on testing and tracing. Every advantage that the United States of America has with our scientists, our public health experts, something has gone wrong here, and I think it starts at the top. I think the president's behavior and comments have undermined our public health professionals every step of the way. Dr. Redfield, I'd like to know, how often do you interact with the president and talk to him about public health guidelines and bringing all of your expertise to bear? How often do you interact with the president?
Well, I have regular interactions with as part of the White House task force as a member to it and participate in each and every one of the task force meetings. And as relates to my interactions directly with the president, I'm going to keep those between myself and the president.
Well, you know, every time the president contradicts scientists, every time he contradicts our public health experts, whether it's the wearing of masks or mass gatherings or drinking bleach or taking hydrochloroquine, it costs lives. And I agree with my colleagues that we really expect you to be more outspoken when it comes to these public health advisories. It will cost lives. It has cost lives. And but I'll change direction now for Dr. Fauci. You know, Floridians are very concerned with the latest spike in cases. The Florida Department of Health announced just a little while ago we've got another 3,300 cases and 64 deaths just since what was announced yesterday. 25% of the total cases in Florida have been confirmed in just the past 10 days. And we have a positivity rate of now up to 13% in the past week. So what message do you have for the state of Florida and other hotspots across the country as we have so many more young people who feel invincible that are testing positive and our economy is opened up? What is your advice to Floridians and others in hotspots?
You know, my advice to the Floridians is the advice I would give to anyone and everyone, to follow the guidelines that we have very carefully thought out and put out in how one can reopen or open America again. And that is to stay within the framework of the particular phase of reopening you're in and to not throw caution to the wind. I think what happens, related to the comment I made a little while ago about the confusion there must be, particularly among young people who have a pent-up urge to go out, which is understandable. But what they need to appreciate is that they are part of a process of the dynamics of an outbreak. And although they themselves may perceive that they're at very low risk for something that would be deleterious to them, by propagating the process of the outbreak, they may be indirectly hurting people by infecting someone who then infects someone who then infects someone who's vulnerable. So they need to understand that. If we could get that message across, that it's not an all or none phenomenon. Getting back to normality is going to be a gradual, step-by-step process, and not throwing caution to the wind.
What about and what about masks for young people? There's a lot of, you know, they look at national leaders who are not modeling your advice and your behavior. What do you say? Because you're a trusted scientist and expert. What do you say directly about wearing masks and mass gathering?
I'll be very consistent, and I'll say it yet again, that you should not congregate in crowds. You should keep distance. And even though many people, for a variety of reasons, do not listen to the, not suggestion, but plea to not congregate in crowds, some people are going to do that anyway. If you do, please wear a mask. And as you wear a mask and you're in a situation where you're getting animated in a demonstration or in a rally or wherever you are, avoid as best as possible the urge to pull your mask down and shout. So plan A, don't go in a crowd. Plan B, if you do, make sure you wear a mask.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank
Kasky.
you, Dr. Fauci. I yield back.
Next, we go to Mr. Kinzinger in Illinois. And
well,
unmute.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm unmuted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the guests for being here. It's a weird time and very important, so thank you. I think, you know, one of the discussions is this communication is important. So whether it's between federal government, state governments, local governments, nonprofits, businesses, but also international governments. And I think we need a lot more information eventually on what the Chinese Communist Party knew, what they withheld. and what real impact they had. And I look forward to that being more investigated. We've all seen the stories about people who are testing positive for the virus and they show no symptoms at all. And in some cases, it was able to spread through entire communities of people without ever knowing that they've been infected. So, Dr. Fauci, let me ask you, given the significant rate of these asymptomatic infections, how can antibody testing improve our understanding of the transmission of COVID-19 and to help identify populations at risk?
Well, one of the things that we need to do, and I think that's very important, and it related to a previous question about getting the kinds of surveillance studies that allow you to get a much better handle on A, the real percentage of asymptomatic carriers, B, the rate at which they infect others, and a variety of other things. I mean, things that are really important questions. We learned, interestingly, actually to my surprise, Congressman, that when you look at asymptomatic individuals and people who are symptomatic, the level of virus in their nasopharynx is almost the same, which is almost counterintuitive. But it is a fact which tells you that the danger of transmissibility is such that it is very important to understand the penetrance of asymptomatic infected people. And when you do get them, you need to identify them, isolate, and contact tracing. And questions that were asked, I don't know, an hour or so ago to the testing issue, we need to do much, much more surveillance testing. And so the 40 to 50 million tests per month that would be available as we get into the late summer and early fall are going to be able to ask some of the questions you're appropriately asking. Brett?
And I just wanted to, if I could just build on that for a second, the 40 to 50 million test, I said, assumes no advances in technology, and that's not even including pooling. I do say pooling because the FDA just put up standards for validating pooling. So we would expect, based on preliminary data we have, that on many tests we can at least pool 5 to 1 and maybe up to 10 to 1. So when you do that math, that I think will be validated very quickly by academic institutions and by large organizations, that number of 50 million is going to go up by 5-fold at least per month.
Great, thank you. And that's what's amazing is, frankly, American ingenuity when we put our minds to it and seeing the advances, and hopefully when we get to a vaccine. So at the beginning of the pandemic, both my wife and I actually experienced what we thought were symptoms of COVID-19, and we recently decided that we'd go in and get an antibody test. I had that done, and I found out that I was actually negative for the antibodies. So Dr. Redfield, in your testimony, you stated that at this point, we don't know whether the presence of antibodies provides immunity to the virus. So with this in mind, how does antibody testing help if we don't know if it provides immunity to the virus? And what are the benefits of an antibody test from an individual patient perspective?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. I think right now at this stage, I think important at the individual patient level, we don't know what it means, particularly in terms of immunity, as Dr. Fauci said earlier. What it does mean, again, assuming it's a reliable, approved FDA test, that you've been infected in the past. We don't know, though, what that means in terms of immunity. Its value to us at CDC is its for surveillance advantage. Right now, we've continued to do surveillance throughout the United States through a variety of different systematic collections we're doing, and it allows us to see what the full extent of the infection. Right now, the data at a national level suggests that for every documented infection that we have as a case report, there's actually about 10 other individuals that actually had been infected. That data will continue to be refined as we continue to expand our antibody testing, but I really think its major role right now is an important surveillance tool.
Thank you. And I'll just add another question. I'll submit it for the record about this virus lasting on surfaces, but with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And I remind everyone that you can submit questions for the record to the task force and the witnesses, and that all opening statements will be entered into the record. So next we go to Mr. Sarbanes from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We can.
Terrific. I want to thank the panel. Last month, the Trump administration announced the launch of Operation Warp Speed to support rapid research and development of COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and so forth. It's a project that's supposed to coordinate efforts across the federal government and engage the private sector, including at least 5 pharmaceutical companies that are developing vaccines. I'm trying to understand a little bit better how that works. First off, there's been some concerns raised about the venture, including potential conflicts among its leadership, conflicts of interest. Dr. Fauci, you've had decades of experience leading public-private partnerships with pharmaceutical companies to develop vaccines. Transparency is important, is it not, in these collaborations?
Thank you for the question. The Operation Warp Speed is a endeavor that is a Department of Defense, HHS, led by the Secretary Esper and Secretary Azar, to try and get diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines done in a way that is coordinated with the maximum speed possible without sacrificing scientific integrity. It's divided up into 3 groups. The leader of this is Monsef Salawi, a person with great experience in industry, as well as General Perna, who is an Army general who's very well versed and very experienced in supply chain processes of getting vaccines, when we do get it, to be produced to the level that is needed, as well as to be distributed equitably throughout our society. So it's a...
Let me jump in, because I wanted to ask Dr. Hahn. I understand that a senior FDA official was initially tapped to lead the vaccine development under Operation Warp Speed, but then left the project out of concerns about political pressures to approve vaccines. I assume you agree that the role FDA plays in this has to be one that's not impacted by political pressure, and that your agency is ready to adopt the highest standards in approving any vaccine that's developed under this initiative.
Congressman, thank you for the question. Your point is very well taken, and I can assure you that we will retain our regulatory independence. We will use the science and data that come to us, and we will use our high standards to assess the safety and efficacy of a vaccine. We have world-class experts who will continue to maintain that. One point I do want to make clear, sir, is that we drew a very bright line between Operation Warp Speed and all of our sponsors. We do not engage in decision-making, neither I, nor Dr. Marks, nor Dr. Cavazzoni, with respect to those decisions. We provide technical assistance, as we do to all sponsors, but we've made it clear that we do not participate in those decisions because we absolutely must maintain regulatory independence and make the right decision for the American people based upon science and data.
Thank you. And again, I'm trying to understand the sort of the boundaries or reach of the Operation Warp Speed effort. So my initial sense is that it was focused on these 5 selected companies that are pursuing vaccine candidates. I'm not entirely clear, and maybe that's not right, but I'm not entirely clear on what this means for vaccine exploration development beyond that. For instance, I've been reading just over the last week or 10 days or so about this oral polio vaccine opportunity. Maybe that has promise, maybe it doesn't, but some inquiry there, I guess, may be warranted. Is that, I'd like to get the panel's perspective on whether you consider those kinds of inquiries outside of Operation Warp Speed, or is Operation Warp Speed broad enough to accommodate those kinds of things in addition to whatever's happening with the 5 companies, and sort of from where your different agencies sit, what's your perspective and understanding of that? So let me just, I guess, go down the line. Dr. Redfield, why don't we start with you, and then Dr. Fauci, and I guess Commissioner Hahn would be the other one.
We'll get brief responses, gentlemen, because his time is up. So
yeah, very quick. The only thing I would say is it's intriguing in terms of the potential of what we call viral interference with these live virus vaccines, whether it's polio or measles, that they may impact another RNA virus from being able to establish infection. So really that's the hypothetical. I think it's intriguing, not for just this pathogen, for other RNA viruses.
Yeah, very quickly. I think your question was, is there room for other vaccines? The answer is yes, through multiple mechanisms. Anything is on the table. It could be through Operation Warp Speed. It could be through a number of mechanisms that we have in our research institution at NIH. So I can understand your concern, but the doors are not closed to other candidates. You could be assured of that, sir.
Congressman, from FDA's perspective, the doors are open there as well. We're working with multiple different sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, as well as Operation Warp Speed. We will look at all data that comes across the door. We will provide technical assistance to all who want to develop a vaccine and therapeutics.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Griffith?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate it. Dr. Fauci and then Dr. Redfield, I'm going to put you all a little bit on the spot because I want to talk about schools. And as you might imagine, a lot of constituents are very concerned about what's happening in the schools. And Dr. Fauci, you earlier made some statements which led me to believe that you believe that not only nationally, but even within a state the size of Virginia, we probably ought to be looking regionally and maybe even locally as to how we do it and how we go forward. Did I understand that correctly?
You understood me correctly, Congressman. And that's the point I want to make because it's really a source of confusion. It's not one size fits all. I think you have to look at it at the local level, the county level, the regional level, the city level, the state level. So we often say, in America, should you or should you not be open? I mean, that's almost a non-question because we're such a large country and so heterogeneous and such a range of involvement of this virus in different parts of the country.
And Dr. Redfield, I'll move to you because in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they often are citing for various things related to schools and others, they cite the CDC. Do you agree with Dr. Fauci and his assessment?
Yes, it needs to be a very targeted jurisdictional decision.
And I greatly appreciate that because my district is 4 hours from D.C., even though people often think I'm right next door. And then the district stretches from the very edge of it, which is 4 hours away, another 4.5 hours, so that it ends up going further west than Detroit, Michigan. And the district, just my district, is larger than the state of New Jersey. So even within the district, we may need to have some additional regional approaches. Would you all agree with that?
Yes.
And Dr. Fauci indicates that as well. All right, Commissioner Hahn, in a statement on March 30th, 2020, you recognized the importance of facilitating access to viral samples in order to speed up the development of tests. You noted that in the future, making viral samples available earlier to commercial developers will be crucial to deploying tests quickly. This certainly will not be the last time we face rapidly spreading novel virus strain. How can the process for obtaining viral samples, especially inactivated viral samples, be improved in the future for quicker access?
Congressman, thank you for that question. And I think that is one of the lessons learned from this situation with COVID-19 is that access to those samples is very important. We would work with NIH, with academics, with the CDC to make sure that those are available. And just to make a point, we, for serology tests, have made a reference panel now available to developers to actually facilitate that. That's an example of what U.S. government, FDA, NIH, and CDC could do.
I thank you, and I apologize. Admiral Giroir, did I say it close to correct?
Or that's good enough.
All right. Earlier this year, you informed this committee that enough testing supplies would be distributed so that the states could test the recommended 2% of their populations per month. Yet, according to Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Testing Trend Tracking Center data, only about 20% of the states are testing the recommended 2% of their population per month, while another 20% are testing less than 1% of their population per month. Has the administration been distributing supplies to states, and if so, why do you believe some states that have testing supplies are not testing more of their population?
So thank you for that. Again, before the full state plans were just received, and this was part of the PPP funding that we've reviewed, and we've reviewed them extensively with the CDC, we set preliminary targets for every state by phone calls with every single state, every single state health officer, epidemiologist. Overall, in May, the target was about 12.9 million tests throughout the country, and about 12 million were done. This is really very good considering many of the states tried to do 3 or 4 times as many tests as they'd done cumulatively during that
So
time.
you think we're on track?
I think we're really on track right now. It looks very good. Some states have underperformed, especially in May. Most of them have improved their performance in June. And our preliminary review of all the state plans, the great majority of them, I mean the overwhelming majority, were very good to excellent. So everyone is getting the message, and I look forward to that.
I thank you. And Dr. Fauci, if I can come back to you. When we first started this, we knew it was going to be tough and that we're probably never going to get rid of this particular virus. But we talked about bending the curve and making sure our hospitals were ready. Based on your comments on PPE and face masks and so forth, I believe that you think that we're probably ready. Maybe not perfect, but we're ready. And have we not bent the curve? I understand it's not over. It's not going to be over anytime soon. We've got to wear our masks and do what we're supposed to. But don't you think we've bent the curve and that our hospitals are now ready?
Well, I think so. We've been through a terrible ordeal, but right now we've hopefully learned this lesson.
Is your mic on?
Sorry, sir. Yes, we've been through a terrible ordeal. We've learned a lot. The preparedness now is clearly logarithmically different than it was in the beginning.
And so we've bent the curve and our hospitals are ready. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we go to Mr. McNerney, coming from California. Would you unmute?
Thank the chairman, and I thank the witnesses for your work and your expertise.
We're going to take a break.
Are you able to hear me there, Chairman?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm deeply concerned by President Trump's decision to terminate the United States relationship with the World Health Organization, and I'm not alone in this concern. The head of the American Medical Association has called the president's move a senseless action that will have significant harmful repercussions now and far beyond this perilous moment. It appears that the president is not acting on sound public guidance, but is instead scapegoating the WHO to deflect from his administration's failure in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. According to a report in Vanity Fair, key U.S. agencies that work with the WHO on critical public health programs were not consulted or asked for an impact analysis before the president's decision to withdraw. Dr. Fauci, were you consulted about the potential public health impact of the United States withdrawing from the WHO? And if so, what were your recommendations?
Jerry, I apologize. We said we were going to take a break at 1:30 so everyone could go to the restroom or whatever for 15 minutes, and Dr. Fauci had to step out. So I'm going to ask you to start over again. We'll take a 15-minute break so everybody can use the restrooms, and then we'll start again with Jerry, and you'll have to repeat your question. This committee stands adjourned for 15 minutes.
this side because his water bottles are right back. Is there a way you can recheck?
Which, the skills camera?
Yeah, it was on the left. I had to move it because, so I just want to make sure you guys can check.
Yeah,
Make
yeah.
sure my camera's not blocking either one.
Yeah, sure.
That's why I leave it there for the pictures.
Is anyone on River right now?
Or if you can just,
Okay, so, with the photographer, just gonna go this down. I just wanna make sure that it doesn't. You're about to move it, is that
no, I
what?
did move it.